I'm here today to talk to you all about a game set in a dystopian future, where rising up against gentrification and control are the main event. It features a parkour-based movement system, you explore wonderful and diverse set pieces, the combat is a little funky, and running past your problems is usually the best option. You can see that game in your head, can't you? But what if I told you I wasn't talking about Mirror's Edge? Hey, it's Bonefather, but you can call me Dad. Marc Ecko's Getting Up Contents Under Pressure is a game with as much to offer as it has words in its title. But first, let's get some context. I believe that whilst some games are timeless, some games benefit greatly from an understanding of the era they were released into. 2006 was a great time for platformers, but very much the in-between of two eras. You had the early noughties producing some games leading the way to modern platforming, like Prince of Persia and Splinter Cell. But primarily the landscape was a stomping ground of PS1-like platformers such as Ratchet & Clank, Jak and Daxter, and even Crash Bandicoot Wrath of Cortex. It wouldn't be until a year or two later where you start getting real heavy hitters in the new style of platforming adventure games, such as Assassin's Creed, Mirror's Edge, and Uncharted, who all begin to lead the way into how platform adventure games are still done. With this in mind, Getting Up is a creation by Marc Ecko, the famous Rhino t-shirt peddling online print empire starting artist and fashion designer. Developed by The Collective and published by Atari, Getting Up is a story of a nobody graffiti artist called Coltrane Crowley, who writes under the pseudonym of Train, in a fictional New York-inspired city called New Radius. Train leaves home with nothing but a dream of getting his name out there through his graffiti. He's gonna get into fights with the local gang who just want to keep him down. He's going to find his voice, and use it to put the power of his art to expose corrupt city officials, all while subverting the wills of a corrupt government and its allies who will stop at nothing to snuff him out. A rich and unique mix of gameplay style and mechanics. Getting Up sees you clambering cityscapes, brawling with half New Radius, stealthing past cameras and patrols, and what sets it apart from every other game of its kind, covering every wall you see in graffiti. The Collective, who are mostly known for their LucasArts and licensed properties, released Marc Ecko's Getting Up on February 14, 2006 in North America, and 10 days later in Europe, receiving average to positive reviews from critics. It was praised heavily for its concept and potential. It also received a lot of criticism for its controls, camera, and presentation. Join me as I cover this game's plot, how it holds up today in 2022, why I think it's still an important story, and how it's inspired a cult following of passionate fans in its wake. The story begins with the demo cutscene, in which Train remembers how New Radius used to be, a bright city of hope, art and culture, and how it has now become a police state, where if you get on their wrong side, you better prepare to keep running, because they won't stop until they find you. Getting Up the game, however, starts with a scene from the end of the game. Train on a huge blimp floating over the city, getting his ship pushed in by an assassin, saying one of my favourite lines from any video game.
Grandma used to say, "Gray hair is God's graffiti." Now I know what she meant.
And then falling to his apparent doom. 3 months prior, Train, leaving his grandmother's home on the night of a public protest, being warned that if he leaves now, he won't be welcome back. An opening shot shows protesters clashing with the CCK, the armed police division that Mayor Sung has established to control the city and its inhabitants. Train decries the protesters as granola-eating hippies and is on his way out for the night. In the slummiest slums to have ever slummed, Train takes what appears to be the only way out of the apartments, climbing up a railing and shimming over a trash, completely blocking the hallway. As he lands, he gets a swift introduction to the vandals of New Radius by way of a plank of wood to the chin, giving chase, but not before a little revenge graffiti of his own, crossing out the previous guy's piece. Train finds himself ambushed by a Van Al grunt as the first combat tutorial begins. The CCK interrupt, claiming that it's curfew time, so like any good, law-abiding citizen, Train clambers his way up people's houses and skulks off through a small tunnel. Sneaking his way past a CCK blockade and learning how to manhandle opponents some more via the second combat tutorial, Train finds himself at the abandoned pool yard and starts a fight with the tank named White Mike and learns to harness the power of 2x4s and rolling. With fighting tutorials being over for the time being, Train starts getting his name up on a few empty walls before heading to the Legends pool and going over Gabe's piece. Gabe is the Van R leader and takes great offense to this. Getting the drop on him with his gang, girlfriend, and a weird middle-aged tag-along called Decoy, they take everything other than his black book, give him a beating, and adorn him with an orange X, which would go on to become his signature. Down but not out, Decoy leaves Train a can of paint to hold him over, instead of a rational thing you do for a beaten person and give them medical attention. Train recovers and takes over the hideout in the art school as an act of revenge, being the location of the rest of Gabe's crew out of a mid-ranking member. Shaving his head and crossing out the back of a hoodie he finds, Train sets out for more vandalism and vengeance. And that's just chapter 1 of 11. To save us covering every great detail, I'll summarise the main plot points of each chapter going forward. Train makes his way through service tunnels to an unused station, causes a ruckus with the maintenance workers, dodges speeding trains and meets up with real-life graffiti artist Coke 2, who goads Train into being mega irresponsible and tagging the walls in the narrow tunnels as he makes his way towards Dip, one of Gabe's big hitters who has a hideout nearby. You save another writer from a Van R beatdown who introduces himself as Cry 1. You wish him luck as you tell him you work alone, and you head off for a departing train. One tense obstacle-dodging subway train tagging section later, you're ready to give this pretentious prep a piece of your mind, but mostly your fist. One beatdown later, and under the threat of a deadly electrocution via the third rail system, Dip gives up where Gabe's hideout is, at the back of a meatpacking plant. Train makes his way over, coming across heavy CCK presence in the process, and thus one of the hardest difficulty jumps in the game occurs. I'm going to pivot a second to talk about how bullshit this level is, and I'll cover it more in the gameplay review section, but anyone who's played Chapter 3 Level 1 Gabe's HUD will know how abhorrently difficult compared to everything else this level is. Anyway, after agreeing to form a crew half-heartedly with Cry 1, SFC, Still Free Crew, is born, and the first order of business is trying to not die while waiting for a van to enter the meatpacking plant. Trying not to die includes tagging in front of an infinitely respawning collection of CCK patrols, meeting graffiti legend Smith who teaches a lesson about not being seen, before telling us to get our name up right in front of a machine gun manned spotlight sentry. Getting the deed done allows Train to leap to a van and ride into the plant, with significantly more holes in him than he had before. Train makes his way through the facility, ruining the day of several workers, both plant workers and CCK, before throwing a guy to his death and walking off like he didn't really just commit murder. The area outside of Gabe's hideout is a dump full of chumps, so we'll skip that and go to the part where Train goes all over Gabe's artwork, calls him a clown, and tackles the next boss fight. Spleen is another of the Van R heavy hitters, who comes at Train with a machete and 2 pit bulls. One fight involving a creative use of buckets and stolen trophies later, Spleen goes down. On his way out with his life in danger from the rest of the gang's retaliation, he takes a few seconds to flirt with Tina, Gabe's girlfriend. An indeterminate amount of time later, Train welcomes Renegade White Mike to SFC upon Cry 1's suggestion, and Decoy breaks into his crib to talk conspiracy theories before telling Train that the mayor has brought out new graffiti-proof silver cars, and it'd be really cool and awesome of him to cover one in graffiti anyway. So off Train pops, with a surprisingly political tone taking over some of his pieces suddenly as he makes his way to the ghost yard through the subway. Once there, which is glossing over a lot of people Train fought with, times he got shot and generally risked his life, Train realises Decoy is actually called Decoy. I didn't really pick up on it until writing the script that the subtitles name him, but he never really actually introduces himself until this chapter. Decoy tells him to stop fangirling and get on with it, but not before learning from the real-life artist Scene that you can cover an entire subway train with graffiti if you try hard enough. Train then Prince of Persia's his way through the chemical treatment facility for these silver train cars and covers the train with a political piece about the brutality of the mayor and his CCK before the treatment can set. This all culminates with news reporter Karen Light witnessing Train atop the graffiti-proof subway car on camera during a puff piece, before immediately reporting on this failing by the government. In a cool transition, we then see Mayor Sung boomerang to the best of his ability, questioning if Train has spelt his name correctly, and asking what an SFC is. Chief Hunt, the head of the CCK, who for some reason kneeling in the scene, tells him not to worry and that he's got it under control. We then go to T-Kid explaining to Train that graffiti can be tall and wide, which blows his mind a little, before Gabe shows up and Decoy decides that the two should settle their beef with a public competition of vandalism. Gabe of course does a mural dedicated to himself, and Train shows Gabe being ridden like a little horsey. This draws the attention of the media and the police, who start making arrests and forcing an uneasy truce as Gabe and Train run to the amusement park on the pier to escape pursuit. Once there, the truce turns into an unlikely alliance as they both have to work together to defeat Aunt Beth, the head of the Vandal squad. Which makes sense. Aunt Beth is the type of lady who thinks tasers are foreplay and can throw away collapsed concrete like it's styrofoam. Upon her defeat, they find Marc as spray cans and stencils and come to the conclusion that the Vandal squad had been playing them against each other. Despite an increased police presence and further Gestapofication of New Radius, the now combined crews decide to rub their two brains together and assume they just hadn't been going for big enough targets. Gabe and Train head for the freeway and the overpasses, playing Frogger with cars and more city maintenance workers before Train meets Shepherd Fairy, who teaches him about wheat paste and stickers. I'd like to point out as an aside that Train never actually unlocks or learns any new skills from these meetings. Everything you unlocked is either rep or level progression gated. I'd have loved if him meeting these artists caused things to unlock mid-level like some graffiti-inspired Metrovania, but unfortunately this isn't the case. Anyway, after more high-risk vandalism, Train and Gabe meet the Wrong Way assassins, who tell Train to calm down and maybe not piss off the police even further, causing him to get even more indignant and rush off to cover the tramnet towers, which is part of the aerial tram system of New Radius, with his art. This is where a lot of people start losing their lives. At least 6 maintenance workers are either thrown from the tower or receive a spray can to the back of the head. Train then covers all of the active trams with political graffiti, exposing how the CCK and Mayor Sung are using graffiti artists as scapegoats to enforce higher security and surveillance of the city, and then act goofy as soon as Karen Light swoops in with the camera and asks them about their message. This is where the story starts with the exposition and spoilers. If you haven't played this game and you think you might like to, I suggest you skip to the next segments of the video where I talk about gameplay and how it's aged. If you know you're never going to play an obscure platformer from 2006, and trust me, I get it, we'll continue in a moment. Train is jumped and knocked out by Decoy. Waking up in Decoy's hideout, he then begins to tell Train about how his father and him used to be criminals together. It landed Train's dad in prison, how he had one way of getting out, which was to do a dirty job for the now mayor. Was assassinating the competition, no big deal. Of course, this led to Mayor Sung wanting to cover his tracks and killing Train's father. Decoy knew all this but couldn't prove it, however, and began posting cryptic graffiti across the city to spread the message of Sung's crime. He also hated how Train was so stupid and putting himself out there on camera, stating that the CCK will have a file on him and being public is going to make it easier to find them. So in a fit of rage, Train storms out to break into the CCK headquarters so that he can find out if they have a file on him or not. He finds Gabe, tells him where he's been, and that they need to go in, and they split up to find a way in. Train finds his way in to find a member of the Wrong Way assassins being beaten to death by the CCK enforcers, and after being saved, he thanks Train and warns him he's getting in too deep and has a death wish. Nevertheless, Train persists further and breaks into the main offices, and does indeed find a file on himself, which is, apparently a big shock, claiming that from that moment on, nothing would be the same, as if he didn't have the option to turn back at any point. He makes his way to meet back up with Gabe and runs into a CCK officer instead. Lol JK, it's just Gabe in his foreshadowing outfit. Train tells Gabe that Decoy was right and he's going to go tag the police chief's chopper in protest after casually lobbing a chaise lounge out of the window that immediately turns into a desk chair. Gabe goes his own way and immediately runs into a rifle loaded with a dual laser dart that can go right through him. Train gets to the chopper before it leaves and lets Hunt know that he thinks he's a butthole by way of etching his name into both sides of his chopper while sustaining heavy gunfire. He calls Train a stinking rat, and Train gets away magically. Resuming the story back at the art school hideout, as everyone's not at all obviously mentioning the absence of Gabe, and a news report tells of a fire in the slums the game started in, blaming Train for the arson done to his grandmother's apartment. Before they have time to react, the art school is set on fire and raided by the CCK, who are insistent on stomping them out this time. Train makes his way to the roof while taking the time to hang a few paintings and posters in the midst of the inferno. Train makes it to the roof, throws a few CCK and Vandal squad enforcers off the building, and Adam West himself tells Train that someone has been ratting on everyone and jumps down to fight Train. One ass whooping later, Hunt tells the snipers to take the shot, missing, blowing up part of the roof, and falling to his death despite the best efforts from Train to save him. The media, of course, frame it so that Train killed him. Outside the wreckage of the art house with surprisingly little police presence, SFC and its allies disband, saying that whilst they wanted to get up, they aren't willing to die for it. Now with an active warrant out for his arrest and nobody else to watch his back, Train tries to get in contact with Gabe. Except Gabe sprints as soon as Train spots him. Train gives chase, but not before going over his wanted posters in the nearby mall. The chase continues to the subway station, where Gabe delivers a swift bat to the face whilst calling to the CCK that Train is a wanted criminal. One timed encounter later, Train is riding the train to Gabe's hideout, where after a combat encounter, you dangle him from a few precarious drops in order to get him to spill the beans. It turns out that the lady with the very convincing firearms made him squeal about everything. Train, SFC, their hideouts, and even Decoy's hideout. Gabe offers for them both to turn over, work for the assassin Shauna and her team of black-suited individuals. Train leaves Gabe dangling to think about what he's done, racing back to find that Decoy has already been done in by Shauna, and with his last few minutes, he retells Train about his father, about how Sung killed him on the 6th of September, or 906 for the Yanks. He tells Train that he's sorry for his involvement of his father's death, and that even from back in the pool yard, he knew Train was his son. Train then, for some reason, tells the audience what we already knew, just in case we weren't paying attention during the Gabe boss fight, and that Gabe is in fact a snitch. Taking up Decoy's stencils, Train decides to take his message to the biggest heights, the New Radius Bridge, informing Karen Light to meet him there in an hour for a scoop. After covering all the signs with messages of Sung's guilt, Train rappels down the side of the middle of the bridge, letting the whole world know that he's still free. Making his way onto the NNR blimp as it refueled, Train plans to sabotage Sung's New Year's Eve broadcast by covering Sung's press background with propaganda regarding Sung's involvement with the murder of Train's father, as well as displaying his CCK squad as nothing more than violent thugs. He also sabotages the printers aboard the blimp, which were scattering political papers to now drop expose of Sung's misdeeds. Train succeeds as putting up his message, but is ambushed by Shauna upon his escape to the roof of the blimp. After throwing her stooges to their nearly guaranteed deaths, Shauna begins a fight. She falls for a Looney Tunes-esque trick of shooting the cable supporting her sniper tower, and they scrap on the roof until Train throws her down to the side platform, and then the final fight taking place where the story began. After another fight, Train throws Shauna from the blimp, is cornered by CCK agents, and he leaps and lands on a nearby building as the New Year counts in. As the clock ticks to 0, you see Train amongst the crowd watching the presentation of the Times Square-esque screen. The curtains lift, and the world is forced to reconcile this version of Sung with Train's message. Sung declares it a stunt, and then resigns immediately anyway. They do this weird thing where Tina and Train see each other in the crowd, and the game acts like the few seconds they shared together was meaningful in some way before Train turns away and disappears into the crowd. Karen Light delivers the closing monologue, bringing everyone onto the same page if they hadn't worked out the plot yet, and reminding us all that despite all else, Train is still free. Okay, so the elephant in the room is this. Marc Ecko's getting up contents under pressure will never be the smoothest gameplay experience. It's smashing together too many gameplay styles to give any of them the attention they deserve if I'm being completely honest. But on the topic of honesty, what saves this game from being a forgettable mid-2000s platformer is its honesty to the culture it's representing and to the story it wants to tell. The art design, the way the levels are absolutely coated in background graffiti from both in-game characters and real-life graffiti artists, down to the very varied and DMCA claimable soundtrack. It's a conscious effort from Marc Ecko and the collective to put forward everything they think is cool and genuine. Or at least I have to believe that, otherwise really cheesy lines like
Grandma used to say, gray hair is God's graffiti,
aren't the result of trying to put in a referential message to pull in outsiders to the culture, and are instead results of corporate meetings of how to sound cool to kids. As a point of order, I captured my footage from the PS2 version through an emulator. I own the game on Steam and I have a physical copy on PS2. The Steam version is perfectly playable, it just has problems with alt-tabbing and windowed modes, which made capturing footage very difficult. PCSX2 rates for compatibility as playable, however for the sake of fairness any visual or auditory glitches I'm going to put down to emulation issues. I did not replay the game on Steam for this review to compare, but beyond the engine's unstableness I don't recall any glitches. It was either crash or nothing. Anyway, back to review. Platforming is simultaneously forgiving and fun while also being frustratingly picky and clunky. To dive further into that, if you're meant to be jumping or climbing there, Train is equipped with high-powered magnets to make sure you make that jump. If you are trying to explore or take the less than optimal path, jumps you could easily make have been walled off despite your target looking just as valid as any other. There's also the issue that most games of this era had, which was walking too close to an object would cause you to cling to it. In Gears of War it was chest-high walls, and getting up it's any pole or girder. The amount of times I was trying to sneak up to an enemy and ended up doing my best Spearmint Rhino audition, which whilst valid is not what I'm trying to do right now. Climbing feels weighty in a good way. There's a smoothness of movement, but it feels weighty, like train carries a natural hesitation. I'm 80% certain that's an accident, but I appreciate it nonetheless. The parkour elements and using them in combat are pretty cool. Both essentially boil down to being told, hey, you can wall jump by the game with a big grin and a thumbs up, but they're fun enough to pull off. The painting gameplay is surprisingly fun, both the big pieces and the smaller freeform pieces. There's a lot of variety between throw-ups, wild styles, murals, roll-up paints, and wheat paste posters. A bunch of these can be all colour customised too. In level you can utilise smaller posters, slaps, markers, spray tags, stencils and glass etches. I think that's all the types. I'm not booting the game back up to check, and you can't make me. If I've missed any, feel free to correct me in the comments. Anyway, the point is, for a lot of these you can chuck them anywhere you feel like in a level and then also customise the colour of the spray and marker based tags. There's a few in-level missions that require you to hit certain targets with specific types of graffiti, and some are just to throw your tags wherever you can on a certain wall a certain amount of times in a time limit. To explain how it works for people who don't plan on playing the game, or people who are on the fence and curious about it still, there are places in a level that have been pre-established as places where you can put up a large piece. As you approach the wall you can choose between one of the 4 designs, and if you want the design to be a standard or a larger size. The 4 designs can be chosen before the mission, with the game asking if you'd like to set up your black book first. A cute in-universe way of tying the menu to the culture. The first slot is always locked per mission, and I'm not sure why. To hazard an uninformed opinion, it may be so train always has a level appropriate piece. You can replay levels with graffiti you've unlocked further in your playthrough, so it might be for that reason. The rest you can select from any unlocked pieces and customise the colour composition from several presets. Back on tangent. Once you have approached the wall and held the appropriate button to enter graffiti mode, not too dissimilar from readying your gun in an early survival horror game, and tool in hand you can get to work, using the analog stick to control hand movement and the square and triangle buttons to control flow speed. It is important to cover as much area you can in the shortest amount of time, while staying still or retreading painted areas as little as possible in order to avoid drips. And this is in order to get the max amount of points, or rep, as you'll need this to complete the piece with no mistakes. This sounds a lot tougher than it is. The graffiti gameplay and its challenges come primarily from trying to find every spot, and for those spots in the way of active dangers, it's making sure that you manage your time and movement correctly to get it done fast while also staying alive. Another key element to keeping train alive is combat. There are a lot of people in New Radius determined that when it comes to Coltrane Crowley, it's on site. Combat plays like a simplified 3D fighter, where you can lock onto a single opponent and your backwards and forward movement become relative to their position. There are kicks, punches, both of which can consume the creatively named power bar. When you hold this button you can do powered up versions that can break through guards. You can grab enemies, punching and kicking them once they're in a grapple to build power or do more damage. Or you can throw enemies to send them and anyone they collide with stumbling. You can of course use the environments with this as well and throw people off platforms for an easy victory. There's a pretty good roll for evasion, and this button also picks up whatever is near you and is enjoyably overdramatic. There is also the option to block against light attacks by holding the target lock button and not attacking. You can use the environment and weapons littered around to do more damage, pulling off cool moves like wall jumping into a Superman punch, throwing televisions at people, or staying with the classic trope of introducing a plank of wood to the faces of your adversaries. There are also taunts and unlockable moves that bring your artistic tools into formidable weapon stats too. You can ignite your spray can to keep enemies away with an improvised flamethrower. You can knock the wind from combatants by introducing your paint roller to their lungs. These moves are unlocked using rep automatically in a static order alongside concept art, characters and stages for the 1v1 multiplayer game mode that I've never actually seen anyone talk about. Fun fact, I actually had to look up how to even access this mode because I've never touched it before. Now that you know what kind of tools Train has to defend himself against the city, how do they all come together? Okay, actually the gameplay for combat isn't as in-depth as games like God of War, and most of the time I found myself sticking to basics of spamming my meter on strong attacks, grabbing them when I was low or wanted to take advantage of the environment. The problem for me personally is that beyond the standard Vannar thugs, all of the CCK enemies and the agent tier enemies towards the end of the game have far too much health and deal far too much damage to make me want to actually engage with that system, especially when stealth has a one-hit KO option, which might actually be the point, to reference survival horror games again. The protagonists of those games are meant to be people mostly unfamiliar with combat to any meaningful level, and the stiffness of James Sunderland flailing with a metal pipe mechanically demonstrates this world-building aspect. This is speculation, but I would like to make the argument that Train, as a scrappy young adult, has the combat know-how to hold his own against street thugs, but comes up short against actually trained professionals. Or I could be talking nonsense and the game was rushed out the door without being balanced well. Who knows? The stealth in this game is the correct level of stealth that my incredibly small brain likes. It works as follows. You can hold the crouch button, L2 on PS2 or your regional equivalent, and if you can get close to the dumbly patrolling enemies, you can hold square and triangle to charge up a knockout by the way of an aerosol can to the head. I've given you all an overview of the story, so I'll let you come to your own conclusions about how that ranks, but personally I really enjoy it. It eases you in with a low stakes and high action Act 1 featuring petty gang rivalries and culminates in taking down a corrupt mayor. It's a wild ride, it's not even remotely believable, but Talib Kweli's performance as Train is so genuine and enthusiastic that he can't help win you over despite being the world's densest individual when it comes to their personal safety. The last third of the game is very rushed, and you almost feel ferried from plot point to plot point. And I can't decide if that's due to there being a desire to keep the pace high, or if there are a lot of levels left on the cutting room floor. I'm not going to cover development of the game, as there is already a wonderful video out there by Go Back to Sleep, and I don't believe in making content that's already been done to a high standard. A link to their video and channel will be in the description as well as my sources document. In regards to graphics, the animated cutscenes in this game are gorgeous. They use interesting visual effects, like changing how the borders of the screen are presented and using them to mess with perceived depth. The in-game world is a little drab and grey, but that's the kind of dystopian city they're trying to represent, so I can't be mad at it. If anything, the environments being so stale and urban are fantastic, because they help the vibe of the stage change completely once you've covered the walls in your graffiti. I've got a very odd critique about presentation, and it's something that stuck out to me a lot and I referenced a couple of times in my story overview, but I found it really odd how gameplay elements were stuffed in for the sake of having them. There are several times in the story where Train either doesn't have time, or it's an incredibly inappropriate time to go around and focus on getting nigga's name up alongside his art. It's not a good time to put up posters in a building when it's going down in flames. There's not even an argument of real grind knows no stops, but if the building is burning down then what was even the point? The last stop on this whistle-stop tour of the aspects of giving up that I have comments on: difficulty. I spoke about this a little bit in both my story overview and my combat overview, but the difficulty in this game is all over the place. As soon as they introduce CCK enemies, the only real option is to stealth take down them, as they have far too much health, especially when it gets to the agents at the end of the game. I understand the game needs to get harder as progression happens, but instead of the combat becoming more challenging, it becomes more tedious. Enemies gain the ability to block mid-combo and can tank more than a Sherman. And to be honest, most times when I failed a stealth attempt, I just reloaded a save state, because I didn't want to face the combat. With all of this being said, is the game objectively worth playing in 2022, or am I viewing this game with glasses tinted by nostalgia? Okay, so to address what might be the biggest issue that some people may have with this game today, there is some language used that was wrong then, but more socially acceptable in 2006. In some of the graffiti and phrases uttered by enemies, there's homophobic and ableist language used. I don't approve of this at all. There are some less favourable stories going around regarding some of the real-life artists featured in the game. I'm not going to dig into everyone's closet with the hopes of finding skeletons. Personally, I'm going to choose to believe that the people involved have grown and learned compassion in the past 16 years, unless presented with evidence to the contrary. But gameplay-wise, on an emulator I finished this game in roughly 10 hours, and that was with trying to collect as much as I could, but without forcing myself to go back and 100% everything. I think that's a reasonable length for a game of this nature. It doesn't really outstay its welcome, and by the time it ends you're ready for it to end. And I mean that as a sincere compliment. There have been some games where I've gotten to the last act and pushed through purely because I knew I was close to the end. In 2011's Warhammer 40k Space Marine is an example of this that comes to mind. I really enjoyed the first 80% of that game, but the last few levels felt like a slog, and I knew that if I didn't push through and beat the game in that sitting, I'd never go back to complete it. Which is a shame because the final boss encounter of that game was actually really dope. Anyway, I'm getting distracted. My point is, Marc Ecko's Getting Up knows what kind of game it is, and the developers behind it added in enough to keep almost every level varied enough in scope and objective that I was always excited to move on to the next scenario, and the ending arrived exactly when it needed to. The story, despite being a touch on the dramatic and fantasy side, is probably more easily related to today than when it launched in 2006. In a post 9/11 world where security became a top priority for many governments, I don't know, would it be a little tinfoil hat to say that this extra security came at the slight cost to our freedom? We're now in a world where we carry small boxes with GPS-capable chipsets in them. They use freely available information from a service from the US government. GPS allows the apps we use to track where we are for all kinds of reasons, but mostly advertising. Our rainwater is now unfit for human consumption, and global warming is destroying the place we call home. And we receive news like this through online articles, tweets, and media we respond to with a shrug. I'm not here to scornfully lecture or politicise about these things, I'm just saying they are facts. And in games like Marc Ecko's Getting Up, they are here to remind us that these things are important, they are worth fighting for, and they are worth raising your voice to make a difference. We shouldn't settle for our status quo, and the world can be changed if something is broken. I've never really been a fan of classic stories when compared to modern tales. Personally, while I can understand the tropes and how the messages can be applied to daily life, the disconnect of not being able to directly relate to the material of, say, Charles Dickens' Great Expectations, which was published in the 1860s, where society and structures have changed to become almost unrecognisable in many aspects. It leads me to have a softer heart for more urban-based tales. Maybe it's a combination of this bias and my general worldview, but replaying Getting Up for this video filled me with a lot of hope in many ways. Playing this game as a seasoned adult, which is, a nice way of saying I'm nearly 30, compared to my playthroughs in my rebellious teenage years, I think both of us got many different things from this story and this game that were important to us at the time and now, and I think that's a great sentiment to end the review section on. No matter your age, I think Marc Ecko's Getting Up, Contents Under Pressure will have something for you, and I can only hope it resonates with you like it did for me, and the dedicated fanbase it built over the years. Getting Up came out in 2006 to modest praise and plenty of criticism, and despite it receiving no sequel except a rumour in 2013, or any official follow-up of any kind, the fanbase has been anything but quiet. Without even giving mention to the countless amount of people inspired to get into or rekindle their love of art and graffiti culture, to this day there is still an active community, spread across Reddit and Discord, discussing their love for this game, their ideas and wants for a sequel, or in recent years, pushing the game to its limits via speedruns. In preparation for this video, I reached out to both Robotic Dream, the current speedrun world record holder, as well as Creep and Crawl 47, who is in charge of running both a Reddit and Discord server. My goal was to understand both what brought them into this fandom and what kept them here 16 years later. Strangely enough, the three of us have something in common. We all first heard about this game the same way, through magazines, which made me feel even more old if I'm being honest. When was the last time anyone bought a magazine? Either way, for reasons similar to mine, a game about graffiti called to us and we were hooked. Creep explained to me their background in other small game communities, calling out Bully, Manhunt, and Scarface A World Is Yours specifically, and decided to bring their experience to Getting Up, so that hopefully the game will get the same post-life recognition it deserves in the same way those games have, with Manhunt getting a sequel and a remaster in the works, with Bully being a long-time classic remastered almost as many times as Rayman 2, and Scarface being remastered by fans since 2020. I had noticed in my research that in the last 6 months or so that the Discord and Reddit had been completely overhauled with new graphics, custom bots, and quality of life features to help revitalise the community. So I asked Creep why now in 2022. They said it was due to the upcoming short film, hold on tight, I'm getting to that bit, that gave them the desire to really get the community spaces up to scratch. And the film's announcement encouraged them to commit the time to making these well-received changes. I've included links to both these in the description for those interested. Speaking to Robotic, I was curious about what drew them into speedrunning, an obscure 2006 platformer, as opposed to many of the other wonderful speedrun candidates out there. And it turns out I wasn't far off. Robotic got their start in speedrunning with Ocarina of Time, another game rife with deep technical glitches, albeit with a bit of a larger fan base. It wasn't until 2016 when Robotic decided to turn their hand to Getting Up speedrunning, where they got to work hunting for glitches and bringing the time down for the any percent category. Which brought me to my next question. I was interested in how glitches are found in a game with a small community, and an even smaller speedrun community. Robotic told me about how a lot of glitches have been solo efforts, but then once a glitch is uncovered and released, the community then works together to see how it can be utilised effectively. A few of the more interesting skips, like graffiti clipping and the ledge floating, occurred randomly, and then it became a task of understanding them, replicating them in consistent ways, and then were released to the community to be implemented. Currently the any percent world record is 1 hour and 21 minutes. Again, for reference, my casual playthrough footage runs up at about 10 hours. And they're not done yet. I've seen that recently the community has been working together to try and fix a memory leak issue that causes the game to crash on PC when many successive levels are loaded, and Robotic reckons that once the issue is resolved, there could be nearly 2 minutes saved from the run, due to not having to relaunch the game in places to avoid these crashes. I asked if solving some of these barriers such as the memory leak issue would help new blood enter the speedrunning scene. And even with this, Robotic thinks the main obstacle stopping others from trying these runs is that there are so many level specific glitches, and a lot of them are performed differently. However, and this is me speaking, not Robotic, I think they're doing a great job trying to document what they have learned and how it can be implemented. So if you're interested in speedrunning this game, or even if you're just interested in taking a peek at some of the glitches in action through their world record run, I've linked their channel in the description as well as my sources document, alongside the full Q&As I had with both Creep and Robotic. To mention also, Devolver Digital bought the rights to Getting Up for publishing, which is why it's now on Steam, ported over by General Arcade in 2016. However, the latest patch was released in 29th of April 2021, and that was actually delivered by fans, who incorporated a widescreen fix and fleshed out the launcher to include way more graphical options. I do want to say I accidentally lied in this video. There has been another game released in the Getting Up franchise, and that's the mobile port, released before the console release on 27th of September by Glue Mobile. This Java-based atrocity is a platformer where instead of exploring and do graffiti, you collect spray cans that colour in the background layer. Look, I understand it was 2005, and Java-based mobile games weren't exactly, good. I think you'll forgive me for never having heard of this game until I began research for this video. And I'll ask for your forgiveness again, as I haven't played this, and I don't plan to. However, I do have a link to a complete playthrough in my sources, so go wild. And now to address a bit of really cool news I brought up earlier. There is a Getting Up short film currently in post-production. It's called Getting Up Legends of New Radius, and whilst details regarding the plot are currently under wraps, we don't know if it's a new story set in the universe or if it's a reimagining of the original plot. What I do know is that it looks fantastic. It's directed by Elliot Montello, who from his IMDb looks like he's great at a whole lot of specialties involved in filmmaking, and starring Radley De Silva as Train. The production looks like a beautiful labour of love. If you'd like to see some of the cool behind the scenes shots beyond the few I've been playing here, I've included a link to Elliot's Instagram and specifically his highlight reel for this film in the sources document. He's also done a Q&A which you can read for yourself in the community Discord, which he gives interested readers a bit of a background of how this project came to be, alongside any other interesting factoids that may take your fancy. So that's Marc Ecko's Getting Up, Contents Under Pressure. It's not a perfect game by any means, but it's a game I love dearly for what it is, and that's a common sentiment shared by fans I've spoken to in the making of this video. A lot of us don't mind that it shows a few wrinkles and has a couple of scars. We love it because it's honest, we love it because it tried to be something new, and we love it because it saw all of us outcasts feeling isolated for one reason or another and said, "Have I got something for you?" Marc Ecko has left hints over the years that he wants to pick up the story again, and that he's got the plotline all worked out. He just needs the right funds and the right people to get involved. Marc also hasn't left gaming completely. After telling interviewers that gamers are all sweaty nerds who didn't understand Getting Up, which is an absolutely correct take by the way, he started his own games company, Marc Ecko Entertainment, also known as Show and Prove LLC, and released 2 Dexter games. The first one, Dexter the game in 2009 for PC and mobile devices, and the creatively named sequel, Dexter the Game 2, in 2012 for Android and iOS exclusively, and they're both delightfully cursed in their own way. It's been 10 years since Marc has released a video game to the best of my knowledge, but whenever fans call out about how much they love Getting Up, it's not unusual for Marc to show up, drop a cryptic emoji or two, and then disappear into whatever project he's currently working on. I hope with this new short film and the work that the community has put into keeping the spirit of this game alive, maybe the future will hold some great news for us and convince the right people to take notice. And there you have it. I'd like to take a moment to thank everyone who helped me with this process, starting with Robotic Dreams and Creep and Crawl. Their relevant links and Q&As I post to them are in my sources document in the description. Please show them both some love. I'd like to thank The Backlogs and Davey Gunface, both terrific YouTubers who both inspired me and gave me advice during this process. Last and no means least, I'd like to thank you for making it this far. Thank you for listening to me wax lyrical about a cult classic platformer from 2006 I've probably had far too many thoughts and feelings about. So remember kids, be rooting, be tooting, but most of all, be kind.